Welcome to Thrive Deeper, the show based on the Thrive Bible reading guides. This is an ongoing conversation about God's Word with Thrive author, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Well, Stu, we're a week late. Do we need to? I feel like we should apologise. Sorry, everyone, if you looked. Yeah. I mean, we're fortnightly anyway, but that was a classic COVID moment. Stu, you very selfishly went and got COVID.
I know, it's not good, is it? But you know what? We'll have two in a row, so that kind of compensates.
Okay, good.
So this week we'll have one, and next week we'll have one.
You can binge on Thrive Deeper.
Binge on Thrive Deeper. So Matt, we're finishing up with Romans on this particular episode 143 of Thrive Deeper. Going to be looking today at Romans chapters 12 through to 16. Mm-hmm. And I think as we move into these last 5 chapters, we kind of see the theology that Paul's kind of presented in the first sort of part of the book from chapter 1 through to 11, how that now informs action and life and how we meant to live as a result. This is not just information, this is actually around transformation. And so Paul demonstrates that the doctrine isn't separate from sort of Christianity.
Oh man, the application is so interesting from this. I'm looking forward to talking through this. And it's interesting because at the beginning of chapter 12, that's stated very explicitly. Even the first word there is therefore, and it's a therefore that covers pretty much 11 chapters of quite dense theological material. Book of Romans is so important in the way that it has informed Christian belief. I mean, it creates a level of clarity that is not just about belief formation, but a life-changing belief formation. I mean, life-changing stuff. In navigating the Christian life, I found the constant reference to things that Paul talks about in Romans. It's just so vital. It's all practical stuff. And it's actually from here that he makes the practicality of it.
That's right.
Explicit.
There's kind of that opening statement, really what he's saying is in light of what God's done, which is what we've just gone through over the last 11 chapters, how now shall we live?
That's right. And I mean, he's talked all about the sacrifice of Christ. Now he's going to talk about our sacrifice.
Personal sacrifice, exactly right.
So, it's this life for life thing. Jesus gave his life for you so that you could give your life back to him.
And what does that mean?
Yeah, and what does that mean? And he says here in the first verse, therefore I urge you, it's this therefore that covers, this is your response. Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, which he's just spent the whole book discussing, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. As a ex-Pharisee, someone steeped in Jewish ideas, it's really a rich idea, this idea of bringing a sacrifice, because of course he's evoking there the temple sacrifices, particularly bringing the offerings, the burnt offering, which was, and I think that's what he's referring here, which is this offering of response to God. This is us. The offering there symbolized the one bringing the offering, and you would bring the offering. It would be wholly burnt on the altar, and this speaks of this sort of transformation that take place. When we are cleansed and cleansed of our guilt, and we can bring ourselves and give ourselves back to God. The burnt offerings illustrated in really colourful fashion what actually happens as the animal was offered on the altar. It was wholly burnt, wholly consumed, and in a sense transformed into smoke. And it's said there that it will be a pleasing aroma going up to God. So the guilty sinner, as it were, is transformed into someone pleasing to God. Someone who evokes the favor of God. And there's this transformation of someone who, in a sense, and I think of the words of both Psalm 15 and Psalm 24, which ask the question, who may ascend the hill of the Lord? This idea of who may ascend, who may go up into the presence of the Lord. And the burnt offering kind of illustrated that. Someone who has offered themselves as a living sacrifice, undergone this transformation that makes them a pleasing aroma, as it were, to God. And this is what he's really alluding to here. And of course, because the second verse, he goes on to speak about transformation.
Yeah. And of course, the challenge for people like me is, and I can't remember who wrote the quote, but the problem with a living sacrifice is it keeps crawling off the altar.
That's right.
And I know that's the challenge for me. We're all gung-ho, willing to lay it down, but then for whatever reason, we find ourselves,
Yeah, and so this is a continuous,
That's right.
This is something that we continually need to do because worship is a constant thing. So this is your true and proper worship. So this is not something that we just do once at some point in our life. No, worship is a lifestyle, and it's all about, presenting ourselves. We are the worship sacrifice, and it's us giving ourselves over to God in order to be transformed, in order to undergo that transformation there on the altar. And so that leads seamlessly into the second verse here, which he says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." So the transformation happens as we offer ourselves over to God. He's not saying get your life together and be transformed that way. So go off and fix yourself up. No, actually by offering ourselves over to God as a living sacrifice, we undergo a process of transformation by the Holy Spirit. And this is the renewing of your mind. It's not just an intellectual thing. It's much more holistic.
I was going to ask you about that because it's an interesting. You'd think by the renewing of your heart, but he says no, the renewing of your mind.
Yeah.
And then is that because there's a level of intentionality where our heart follows our mind in a sense? We've got to, in a sense.
Yeah, I don't think he's that sort of dichotomy, which heart and mind, which we often create a bit of a dichotomy there between the two, or. It's really one and the same thing here. I don't think he's working with that kind of dichotomy. This is a whole, I think what he's alluding to here by the renewing of your mind is a completely new way of seeing and understanding life.
Right.
And that understanding is as much a heart thing as the understanding of the heart. I mean, often, the Old Testament speaks about the understanding of the heart. There's a kind of, and again, I'm working with that dichotomy, but it actually is a bit of a false dichotomy, that kind of heart-mind thing in a way. I mean, it's useful in some senses to separate that because there are some things that you can just know intellectually and yet not really know.
And I think for me too, there are some times where you have to make a decision not to do something.
Yeah.
And it's only after regularly making that same decision that your heart follows in a sense, and you no longer want to do that.
Yeah, that's right.
It might be.
Yeah. But here, he's saying that you actually are, as you offer yourself over to God, you are actually going to undergo a transformation that is going to be very much a completely different way of seeing and understanding things. And I know from experience that it's that breakthrough of not just an intellectual, I understand that, but I actually see something from a completely different perspective. And it actually does completely change the way that you feel about things. It has a very holistic impact on your life, and I think that's what he's talking about here. And because he goes on to say, then you'll be able to attest and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Like then you will know. Oh, yes, this is right. Now I get. There's been so many things that I've known about what God wants. It's like you got to be humble and kind, loving, but there have been these breakthrough moments where I've actually, from the inside, realized, this is what love, this is what humility, but really from the inside, like I could have, reeled off Bible verses and given you a technical definition of it, but there's something about this spiritual realization of and a taste for it that you can't untaste.
Yeah.
That's what I think he's taught. Then you will know. Then you will be able to test and approve. Not in the sense that you say, God's right after all. Yeah. But you will really know and see the rightness of what is right. You really are going to taste it.
That's great.
It's interesting from here the sequence. I think you could easily feel that Romans 12 is just disconnected advice or disconnected exhortations, but actually is very connected. There's a real flow here, this offering your body as a living sacrifice, really this transforming of the mind to a completely new perspective, okay? And then you'll kind of get it, right? And then he goes straight into, I say to everyone, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. This is part of what's going to change because he's talked about don't conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And this is kind of what's going to happen. You're going to have a new view of yourself, and it's not going to be a low view of yourself. You are going to understand. So when he says, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, he's not saying that you should think that you're nothing and insignificant.
Yes.
That's not.
That's false humility.
He's going on to talk about real humility, which is a recognition. It's not a denial of the absolute sacredness of which, Paul's working within a framework of, an understanding of the absolute sacredness of human life and every human being as a child of God. But he's working within a culture that clearly saw that there are some people that are greatly significant and that there are some people that are almost nothing, almost worse than beasts in some senses,
right.
In a multi-tiered society, that you've got the emperor who's like a god down to the slaves who just have no value at all. And, he's saying to a church who have, people from high tiers of society right down to slaves in the one church. Yeah. And he wants to say to them, he wants them to realize that they all have this vital part in the church. This is this is the practical of therefore. In a sense, faith puts us all on the same level, right? We all are recipients of grace, of the grace of God. None of us warranted it. So we're all put on the same footing. And it's not that we're not valuable or significant, because if we weren't valuable or significant, why would God pay for us in the suffering and death of Jesus Christ? That underscores the fact that we are infinitely valuable to God.
Yeah.
So therefore, no one should think, oh, I'm better than that person. Yeah. This is the point here. So, he's talking in a very, very multi-tiered class society.
Yeah.
Much more than, much. We're not a very class-conscious society. I know on my the British side of our family, very class conscious, and our family was always at this tier that were kind of sort of up there, but not up there as they wanted. And my grandfather had, always, had a copy of Burke's Peerage, which says who was who in, a very famous book about, who's who in the British aristocracy and where you fit. And, we had some sort of family members in that, but they always wanted to marry up. And so I always remember how incredibly class conscious, my grandparents really were, as still very much coming from that British background. And so I kind of get this in a society where actually your life depended on where you were in the class in some senses. So to a very class conscious church, he's saying, don't think of yourself in that sense. Don't think you're significant and this person isn't.
And it kind of leads into this whole conversation around us understanding our place in the body, that we need to see everything through the glasses of grace. So we've got our personal sacrifice on the altar, but then it's talking about, well, what's our sacrifice in the body, and laying down the sense of our superiority or our being more important.
That's part of what's being offered on the altar. It's that false self, that false identity.
Yep.
He's also, alluding here to the Jew-Gentile thing. There's a spiritual superiority thing. That he wants to, and it's interesting actually when you go into chapter 14, he's going to talk about issues, and he's going to talk about the weaker brother. It's interesting that it's most probably the Jewish people that he's referring to as the weaker brother in the example that he uses, which is interesting, because it's a slight, it's in some ways, it's almost an insult. If you were going to hold on to that sense of superiority, that's going to flatten your balloon.
Yeah.
So he's really concerned here that everyone understands, okay, this is a new way of thinking. We're being transformed by the renewing of your mind. You need to see things differently.
Yep.
That every single person has a place, a vital place in the body of Christ. We're all recipients of grace. We all have this place. And so he goes on to speak about, he says, verse 5, so in Christ, we, though many, form one body and each member belongs to all the others, right? We are absolutely vital to each other. So that's his, so humility in a sense is, as he casts it here, and he goes on to speak of humility more explicitly, but it's understanding how dependent you are, that you're not more important. We are all immensely significant, so it's not it's not viewing yourself,
right.
in a deprecating way, and depreciating your fundamental humanity. Sorry, it's ditching all of that, spiritual superiority, class superiority. We see things, we share a common humanity, and we are absolutely vital to each other. And it's getting rid of that dog eat dog kind of, I'm building my own identity and I belong here and you're there. And so it's such a vital idea. And it's an idea that he's going to expand on as we go into chapter 14 and 15. It's going to be really important. The rest of chapter 12, Stu, because we need to scoot along here. Some beautiful, bits of advice relating to that, sincere love. And of course, love is a recognition of the infinite value of another person. That's sincere love. It's not insincere love is in a sense, I love a person because of what they offer me or because they're an object of desire, or, sincere love is that recognition of infinite value. Honor one another above yourselves. It's just great. Keep your spiritual service, keep serving the Lord. And then he goes into the bless those who persecute you. This is a really important part of the living sacrifice. This is about following Jesus, in living this sacrificial lifestyle.
Yeah, that's right.
If someone offends you, it's like Jesus gave up his rights.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not saying don't be assertive and don't communicate with each other about how they might have hurt. It's not saying that. It's saying you have no right to harbour bitterness and judgment against another person.
Yeah. And even beyond that, saying sacrifice your own likes or dislikes or preferences or partisan positions for the sake of Christ, for the sake of the gospel message. Be willing to lay all of that down.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's not anywhere near as important as the
that's
message
right.
of Christ.
It's one of the important things here is how the end of chapter 12 bridges into the beginning of chapter 13. Chapter 13 goes on to say, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Now, that thought actually flows seamlessly out of the one before, and I think and of course, this has been very topical in the last couple of years, because there's been strong feelings around how the government has dealt with the pandemic and so forth, and there's this sense that I'll honour the government if I agree with them, if I think that what they're doing is right, then I'll But actually, Paul and then Peter actually in his letter makes this even more explicit when he says, "Submit yourselves to the governing authorities," and then he says, as an example, and it makes it very clear, the grammar of, I think it's 1 Peter 2, could be 1 Peter 3, makes it very explicit. When he speaks to slaves, it's under that same idea, be in submission to your authorities. And then he says to slaves, submit yourselves even to the masters who treat you poorly.
Yeah.
For the sake of your witness to them, it's just incredible application, so countercultural for us, this application of this sacrificial living. It's actually about the message. It's not about you getting what you want and getting what you think your rights are. You need to do this because Jesus gave up all of his rights for the sake of the gospel, and you need to do the same. And that's the point. It's not about being a walkover or, it's about for the sake of the God. This is all about Christian witness and being good citizens. And so this is the idea. So in chapter 13, in Romans 13 here, the idea, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, flows out of what he's saying before. Do not repay, verse 17 of chapter 12, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone, right? So don't go starting and this is the key idea here. Don't go starting a revolution. We're not going to upturn the order the way that the world does it, right? We're not going to fight with the weapons of the world. We are going to win the battle the way that Jesus did. We're going to self-sacrificially love and honor people, okay? And that love and honor needs to be extended to their authorities. Not because they warrant it, actually. That's not because we didn't warrant it. I mean, it's just talked about that, the whole of the letter. Yeah. So, and then, it goes on and it gets stronger. Do not take revenge, leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it's mine to avenge. Okay, so don't strike back. And verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's how we're going to do it. We are going to overcome evil with good, not by force. We're not going to, we're not going to start, and this was always this is important at this time too, because the Roman authorities Christians did what those who practiced the pagan religions didn't do, which is Christians formed congregations. Right. Pagan religion didn't encourage congregations. In fact, the Romans didn't even want people congregating. Yeah. A whole lot of people getting together, that looked like trouble to them. So it was never encouraged. Now, Christians were encouraged to do that. It drew a lot of, it drew some trouble on them. Now, they did underground. They gathered in smaller groups and in different ways, a little bit like we've been doing this, But they still put a big, a lot of importance on staying connected with each other. Yeah. So Paul is making sure here that, there is, when you gather together, you're not gathering together to start a revolution and upturn the social order by force. That's not how we're going to win this. Yeah.
And the perfect example of that is Jesus the night before when he is to be arrested and Peter cuts the ear off of the Roman guard. You'd think, well, that's perfectly justified. You're about to arrest, to crucify.
Yeah, that's right.
And Jesus says, no, that's not how we're doing this, and heals the guy.
Yeah, that's right. Like, exactly. And so that thought is what goes into the, do not overcome, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, right? Now, at the time, the governing authority was Nero. He was the emperor. Nero was, the guy was a nutter. I mean, he was, look, they all were murderous tyrants on the whole. I mean, some emperors were better than others, but they weren't, they weren't good. They were tyrants, and
Nero was,
and they were pretty cruel.
Paul to death in the end. Wasn't
that's right. That's right. Nero,
which was soon after this was written.
So Paul himself would be imprisoned, put to death under the governing authorities, and he didn't try to shirk that. I mean, he was wrongly that was all wrongly done, but he's, I mean, he in a sense, this was his sacrifice, so he really lived this. Yeah. And, he says I think it's in Philippians, as when he was in prison, rather than thinking this isn't fair and I got to fight against my, fight for my rights, I should not have been in prison. He finds purpose in that place.
Okay, well,
it's become apparent to all of the palace guard that I'm in chains for Christ, and I've been witnessing to everyone, and so he it's purpose over preference for Paul. He's always serving the gospel.
It's great.
He just reminds them as the chapter draws, again, keeps bringing them back to, we're living by love here. We're living for other people. Okay, that's the and because this age is like a blink, right? This age is all about serving God. So this is where he gets to. Look, the time is short. Yep. Whether it's between now and the return of Christ, when he says the time is near, it's the kind of imminence he's talking about is to do with the fact that the next sort of a big event on the prophetic calendar is the return of Christ. Yeah. This period is a period of mission, right? So get about the mission. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Get about the mission. That's because Jesus is coming back, and that's the most important thing. Speaking of purpose over preference, this is where he's speaking to a church that are having all sorts of problems
Yep.
around the way things are done.
And this is chapter 14.
We're going into chapter 14 now.
And he's really dealing with specific issues in that church at that time.
That's right. And they are, and in a sense, the church is threatened with, significant disunity because of these issues. And of course, we know that, Jesus prayed for unity for the themes of unity throughout the New Testament. It's like unity. We've got to keep the unity, guys. Come on.
Yeah.
You've got to transcend these differences in the ways of seeing things and and this is the kind of situation that he deals with here. It's interesting. And I think it's N.T. Wright who really sees chapter 14 as the issues there as the thing that occasions the whole letter.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That here's a divided, a church that's sort of bickering. And he goes, they misunderstand. They misunderstand the gospel and they because it's a bit between Jews and Gentiles. There are these sort of factions and, the Jews have come back. They've been exiled from Rome. They're Christian Jews, but they've come back. The church is kind of all this Gentile church and
you're eating the wrong food and you're not acknowledging the right holidays. And
that's right. So there are all of these issues. So think in terms of communion, for example. So, and communion in those days was sitting around. Actually, it was a literal meal. As is made evident by Paul in 1 Corinthians 11. They shared a meal. Now you can imagine the problems with this, Stu. Okay, so Priscilla's out the back cooking up a nice roast for the meal that they're going to sit around. But the Jewish person wants to know, is it kosher?
Yeah.
And you can imagine the bickering that's hang on, I've just cooked this great, roast for you, and you're just, no, I'm not going to eat that, and you shouldn't eat that too. And that suddenly they're, the very thing that should unite them, the meal, is becoming a source of disunity rather than unity. The communion meal was meant to be a sign of their unity. And essentially it's becoming a place of disunity because of differences over food laws and so forth. And so this is what Paul addresses here. He said, listen, you just need to bear with one another, and that's the advice that he gives here. He says, the fact that, because one of the issues, a lot of Jews actually in the diaspora outside of Jerusalem, because in Jerusalem you could get kosher meat, but you couldn't, that, wasn't guaranteed in all of the other places, particularly in Rome. And invariably when the animal was slaughtered, it would be dedicated to some god. So a lot of Jewish people were vegetarians as a result of that. Even to this day, actually, a lot of Jewish people, become vegetarians for that reason. That's why if you often go to Jewish food places, they'll have these like falafel things, and it's like this whole culture built up. Of food around this idea of Jewish diaspora that just wouldn't eat meat because they couldn't be sure that it was. So, for example, Jews won't have any dairy products and meat products on the same bench. So this is the sort of thing they're worried about. So did you have dairy products? Well, no. So suddenly, I'm not eating that food, and so Paul, Paul is saying, look, the fact that an animal's dedicated to it, look, it doesn't, it doesn't really taint. It's not, there was a time when all of that had an importance, and those laws were there to actually instill something. But that time is over. And now we get the principles. We carry the principles forward, but yet he says, but you need to, but understand, people have done this. They've got these scruples around, and you just need, just be sensitive to that. And this is where he talks about the weaker brother. Be sensitive to those who have scruples. It actually could be even, Gentile Christians who, because of that association with idolatry, perhaps they might feel, I just don't feel like I can participate in that. Paul says it's really important that everyone does things on a good conscience, And look, I mean, whether something is sacrificed to an idol or not, it really doesn't make a difference. But if it's something that on a person's conscience does actually make a difference to them, or then you've got to be considerate to that person.
So what he's saying is unity is more important than agreement.
Exactly.
We don't have to agree, but we can still be united.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so there's significant disagreement, and so I think it's a wonderful way of, I guess, because he's not going and saying, oh yes, this group is right and this group is wrong as such. He's saying, look, there's something higher than this. There's a higher unity. Just bear with one another for the sake of the unity. Whether you think they're right or wrong, there's something bigger here.
And Matt, that unity actually is what reveals the love you were talking about before. Because you're willing to make those sacrifices out of love for the other person.
Yeah, that's right. So he says into chapter 15, verse 7, accept one another then, just as Christ has accepted you. This is the sort of the outcome of this. You need, that's the way they are. That's the way that they see things. Whether they're right or wrong. And he, in some cases, he points out, look, then this is they've got this issue of conscience. It actually isn't as harmful as what to them as they think it. But you know what?
For the sake of unity.
For the sake of unity, just transcend that. Just try to just bear with one another because there's something more important here. I think this is so important, and I think most churches, like our church, Stu, is fairly post-denominational. I mean, there used to be a day where all of the Anglicans, of that went to Anglican, all the Baptists went to, and all. Whereas I think we're in a sort of post-denominational age where you have churches gather with people with still the fundamentals in common. We still need to be united in the fundamentals of which is partly why Paul covers those fundamentals.
Yes.
Because he says, look, unite around this. Right?
These are the essential things.
These are the essential
things.
Things.
These are the non-essential
These are the non-essential things.
Yeah.
And I think, this is always so significant because there are so many things that could divide us, things that we, feel passionate about. I mean, whether it's political things or those things of practice, one person might be okay with alcohol, another might not. The person that might not might have really legitimate reasons because there's been an issue with that. The person who doesn't just needs to be sensitive to that other person. The person that doesn't shouldn't judge that person as that,
And that's what love is.
Exactly.
This is love.
Exactly. Let each one make up their own minds, as to what what's right, but let's focus on the bigger picture. And he's covered the bigger picture. So I think, there is, Paul is writing to a church that has so much potential. It's a strong church. I mean, he's encouraged by their faith, but he wants to ground. He's like he kind of sets this really deep foundation for them, so that grasping all of that, they can transcend relatively petty issues. And I think that is always something that we need to.
And he's writing to a church he's actually never been to as well.
Yeah,
so
that's
he's
right.
having to try to unpack this from a distance.
Yeah, that's right. So I think I mean, there's so much to learn from this letter, and those chapters, particularly chapter 12 and 13, and I mean, it's just such rich material in there. I really encourage our listeners to just to read that over and over again and to reflect on that. I keep coming back to these chapters, Stu, because they're just so rich, and I think I love the experiential dimension. He's covered all of the beliefs, but we actually have access to something real here. We've got access to something real. And if you put first things first, and if you give yourself over to this and you commit yourself to the bigger picture, you will experience something life-changing.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thrive Deeper. Our home on the internet is thrivetoday.tv. You can contact us, ask questions, see all our resources and much more at our website thrivetoday.tv. We really appreciate the questions and thoughts about what you're reading as we go through the Bible with Thrive. Until next time, our prayer is that these shows will inspire you to go deeper and thrive.